One of the defining moments of the 2008 presidential campaign came almost a year ago when Barack Obama, then on the campaign trail, spoke before an audience of donors in San Francisco about the bitter political mood in Rust Belt towns where voters had turned to guns or religion or antipathy to people who aren't like them out of displaced economic frustration. He was quickly accused of being elitist and condescending and dismissing real, deeply felt concerns about religion and morality. And although he quickly apologized, for the rest of the campaign, Obama's fraught relationship with white working class conservatives would grab headlines and dominate political discourse. Political pundits suggested that Obama had adopted the argument advanced by Tom Frank in his 2004 book, What's the Matter with Kansas? That white working class voters had been seduced by family values politics into supporting an economic agenda that ran counter to their material interests. But the problem with populist conservatism has been a preoccupation of historians ever since Richard Hofstadter wrote about McCarthyism in the 1950s. Historians writing about conservatism have argued that the white working class backlash against the radical social movements of the 1960s undid the liberal consensus of the post-war period. The argument was put forward by Thomas and Mary Burton Edsel in their 1991 book, Chain Reaction. And the argument is that canny conservative politicians were able to capitalize on popular resentment towards civil rights, feminist, anti-war, and gay and lesbian movements, itself partly a product of economic frustration, in order to win support in electoral contests and ultimately win the White House. As Obama's remarks in Pennsylvania indicated, this narrative of conservative success, focused on the culture wars, has transcended the academy. It's generally seen as the main causal story in explaining the rise of the right. This story has much truth to it, but in recent years, historians have started to tell a different narrative, one that puts political economy at the center of the story. Although this is part of a larger shift in the historiography towards seeing the conservative movement as developing over the entire post-war period, as some of our panelists were just saying, instead of in its reaction to the 1960s, the major reason for this new research has been the success of the free market economic agenda, which until recently seemed totally dominant in Washington, which is hard to explain if one focuses primarily on cultural politics. This new interpretation illuminates certain areas that the earlier one left obscured, while also raising new questions of its own. What do I mean? I mean, Kimberly Phillips Fein. What do I mean by restoring political economy to the history of the conservative movement? First is the question of what led American voters to support a free market, anti-liberal economic agenda in the second half of the 20th century. Historians have become increasingly dissatisfied with the idea that people voted for conservative politicians only because they were driven by their social politics, that they voted to end abortion or gay marriage and were deceived into supporting tax cuts, deregulation, and the reduction of the welfare state. Instead, they've started to make the case that the free market worldview actually appealed to voters on its own terms, and to develop a more nuanced version of the relationship between cultural politics and economic ideas. For example, Shane Hamilton in Trucking Country argues that long-haul truckers who opposed regulation during the 1970s and became early working-class proponents of libertarianism emerged out of a rural economy and sought to maintain their image of economic independence even as the farming world that they had known declined. Bethany Morton's work on Walmart suggests that a patriarchal economic worldview grew organically out of the Society of the Ozarks, and that it reflects the beliefs of people who had never really been part of the Fordist economy. Such projects bring political economy back into the story of the rise of the right by showing that voters were not motivated only by their social concerns at the ballot box. They were also driven by their economic ideas, and in fact their economic and social beliefs could not be so easily separated. And I think this is what some of what Joe Crispino was getting at. This work shows us that even though it might seem that working class or lower class people ought to support liberal economic politics, in truth, economic ideas are not simply derived from class position. They themselves depend on organizing and politics and cannot be presumed from the outset. A second way that scholars have started to return political economy to the history of the conservative movement is by studying the ways in which the economic agenda of the movement took place. This work is less focused on the question of why people vote as they do and why voters elected politicians who supported this agenda, and more on the internal history of the conservative movement, the sources of its ideas, the nature of its material support, and the ways it managed to build its institutions. My own work, in Invisible Hands, has dealt with the role of business activists and wealthy individuals in supporting and pushing forward an anti-New Deal economic politics over the entire post-war period, and their attempts to win ever broader support within the business community for such activity. And there are quite a few other dissertations in the works that look at the political evolution of business in the post-war years, and especially the 1970s. Although there are differences of interpretation between these projects, they all change the historical narrative by focusing attention away from working class supporters of the conservative agenda and toward those who contributed to it in one way or another from the elite level. They provide a different view of the idea of consensus around liberal economic policy in the post-war period by suggesting that elite support was more fractured than we'd previously imagined. And they offer various stories about the ways that the economic vision of the conservative mobilization took shape and the contributions made to it by different kinds of business organizations. Instead of seeing the rise of the conservative movement largely in terms of episodic struggles and electoral victories, they suggest that we must also consider the development of ideas, institutions, and an economic agenda over time. And they indicate that to understand the rise of conservatism, we need to look not only at its working class supporters, but also at its elite advocates. More work is needed on both the popular response to free market economics and on the elite mobilization behind this economic agenda. In particular, I think that more should be done on the development of conservative economic ideas, and especially the relationship between the academy and economics departments. I'm actually doing this. This being the and the conservative movement. I also think that more research should be done on the intellectual and institutional connections between social and economic conservatism. There are also a set of important questions about the relationship between politics and the economy. The period over which the conservative movement became successful, the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, was one of profound economic transformation. The rise of globalization, the decline of manufacturing, and the shift to a service economy. How did the rise of conservative politics affect the way in which these economic changes were understood and experienced by the American public? Did the success of free market ideology facilitate these economic transformations, or simply offer a lens through which people interpreted what was happening? What is the relationship between conservative success and the increase in economic inequality over the past 30 years? How did business cope with the economic changes of the 1980s, especially those that had long supported the conservative movement but now faced economic extinction as a result of the application of the ideas they'd long championed? Finally, looking at political economy offers us another way of thinking about the legacy of the conservative movement. Any historian of conservatism needs to think about how writing the history of this movement will change in the current context of its apparent political defeat. The idea that the conservative movement is dead, to quote a recent New Republic headline, has been gaining currency ever since Obama's victory last November. But regardless of what happens to the movement leaders and their organizations, the economic ideas of the conservative mobilization continue to hold great sway, and the institutions that were developed to help business lobby in Washington maintain their hold to a great extent. There is a difference between the movement itself and the philosophical and political mindset that it helped legitimate. Looking at the movement's leaders and at its cultural politics may make it appear as though conservatives have been routed. But looking at political economy affords a different and bleaker view, one in which their victories appear far more thorough and far-reaching, even at a moment when the limits and flaws of an anti-government, low-tax, anti-regulation approach seems more evident than ever. And the next speaker will be Angela Dillard.